The lens through which I now see. I am an immigrant. I was born and raised in Brazil. I moved to the US on my 16th birthday. I have lived in the Midwest the entire 25 years that I have resided in America. My identity formation growing up in another country shielded me from developing an early awareness of myself as a person of color. Growing up in Brazil, I always thought of myself as a sort of white, cisgender, able-bodied female. Even more accurately than sort of white, I always knew myself to be a morena, which is a word used to describe a Latina who is tan with dark hair and dark eyes. After moving to the US, this changed for me. I officially became a person from a minority race, and I found myself unprepared to navigate American society. Over the past 25 years, I have had to learn to balance a confusing dichotomy produced by the intersectionality of my identities. Kimberly Crenshaw developed the notion of intersectionality to explain how different types of discrimination interact and fail women of color in multiple ways. In America, the intersectionality of my marginalized identities make me an immigrant female of Hispanic or Latinx ethnicity, whose English is a second language. By contrast, I also hold privileged identities. I am a college-educated person with a graduate degree, employed full-time in Christian higher education as a professor, a member of the Catholic faith, married to a white man for over 20 years, living in an upper-middle-class neighborhood, raising our 4 children together. When a person of color does not grow up in America, the development of a critical race consciousness becomes delayed. In the book Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates explains this confusing dichotomy using a term that he calls living in someone else's dream. Ta-Nehisi said, "What divided me from the world was not anything intrinsic to us, but the actual injury done by people's intent on naming us, intent on believing that what they have named us matters more than anything we could ever do." In America, injury is not being born with darker skin, but everything that happens after. Because of this, Ta-Nehisi moved his family to Paris so his son could experience the feeling that he never had growing up. Ta-Nehisi said that in America, he felt like he had missed part of the experience because of my eyes, because my eyes were made in Baltimore, because my eyes were blindfolded by fear. This helped me reconcile the complicated dichotomy of who I am as a sort of white Brazilian and an American person of color. I now understand why I hadn't developed my own critical consciousness with deep ingrained fear. It was because of my eyes. My eyes were made in Brazil. Reading Lennon Dixon's Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education has helped me put into words what I could not articulate before. Critical race theory is a theoretical framework that challenges the ways in which race and racial power are constructed by a white regime of law and culture that serves to perpetuate the illegitimate hierarchies of white privilege and social injustice. Using a critical race theory lens to view the world has helped me to begin to understand the relationship between race and inequity and how a regime of white supremacy serves to perpetuate both. I started to reflect about this relationship within the context of socially acceptable covert racism versus socially unacceptable overt racism. I recently experienced this at my last workplace when I was singled out by my own boss during a department meeting for being the only person of color in the entire department. I know she meant well. She was trying to bring awareness that our department lacked racial and ethnic diversity. But she did this at the expense of singling me out in front of everyone because of the color of my skin, and not for any other reason. I became the token employee, the only one. It hurt me. This is an example of intent versus impact. Even though her intent was good, the impact it had on me was not. To best understand intent versus impact, one must understand how covert racism works. Covert racism is defined by Philomena Essed as a discriminatory act in which negative intentions cannot be inferred from the act itself, but are integrated into the situation. whereas in overt racism, the discriminatory act against people of color are openly expressed with negative intentions. Covert racism acts include declarations such as Make America Great Again, or English only initiatives, or It's just a joke. These common sayings in American society have always been hurtful and bothersome to me, especially because I am foreign. But before learning about critical race theory, I had not made a formal connection between such statements and racism. Before I started to grow into my own critical consciousness, I used to think that these were ignorant statements made by ignorant people. Now I realize I was too naive and failed to recognize them as microaggressions and to see the larger complex societal issues underlying them. Daniel Solorzano defines microaggressions as subtle verbal, nonverbal, or visual insults directed towards people of color, often automatically or unconsciously. These types of statements do not stem simply from the individual ignorance of a few bad apples. Charles Lawrence said that they occur as a result of acculturation into a dominant system of beliefs about race and ethnicity. Regardless of the motive or intent, these microaggressions are hurtful to those who they are aimed at, like myself. What has helped me best appreciate the concept of intent versus impact is understanding the concept of counter narrative. Critical race scholars frequently use counter narratives or counter stories as a way to dispute a commonly held belief in order to reveal racial biases and expose racism. In other words, the counter narrative exposes how the perpetrator's perspective differs from the victim's perspective. Brown and Jackson explain that the perpetrator's perspective views racial discrimination as the result of conscious discriminatory actions by individuals, not as a social phenomenon, because society needs to eliminate its villains. This very statement about discriminatory actions by individuals removes the responsibility from those not considered perpetrators, which is a problem, and ignores the systemic roots of racism. If only the villains are culpable, then others may be perceived as not being a part of the problem, which explains why covert racist acts, such as not challenging a racist joke, color blindness, Eurocentric curriculum, self-appointed white ally, denial of racism, denial of white privilege, assuming that good intentions are enough, and more, occur daily in our society. I find this sickening. How can any form of racism, whether overt or covert, can be considered socially acceptable? And yet, this is the reality we live in, and something that I have now become consciously aware of. Although well-intentioned, many of my friends are sadly a byproduct of a white supremacist society that created a socially acceptable form of covert racism. I have also been at fault and became a byproduct of the system myself. Shame on me. I am white enough to benefit from white privilege, and at the same time, ethnic enough to suffer from racism. This confusing dichotomy leaves me feeling helpless, confused, and paralyzed. After learning about Solorzano's transformation resistance theory, I was able to frame this reality within Paulo Freire's levels of consciousness. Could it be that I have been operating in a state of naive consciousness, where people try to change themselves by assimilating to the white middle class, the mainstream culture? Was I in a naive state of consciousness? Oh no, I think so. An example that happens to me frequently. I am a person who is full of ideas, and my last workplace took pride in welcoming new ideas and innovation. But for some reason, my ideas were frequently rejected, only to resurface later and be accepted as the team's idea. Could this be because of covert racism? This realization has been bothering me for several months now, especially since I was publicly named the only person of color in my department. Frankly, before becoming critically conscious, I was okay with my department taking on my idea as their own, as long as it was accepted. But now that I understand how interest convergence plays in these types of situations, I am not really feeling okay with it anymore. Dr. Derek Bell coined the term interest convergence, to explain the fact that white people tend to support people of color's agendas only when there is something in it for them. All I can say now is that I am woke. My state of consciousness has changed from naive consciousness into a critical stage of consciousness. Daryl Smith challenges institutions of higher education to reassess their culture, to examine the ways by which current practices continue to promote discrimination and inequality. Research shows that leaders at institutions of higher education tend to hire people who are like themselves and perceive them as more qualified. Research has also shown that a diverse workforce provides benefits in terms of creativity, productivity, and credibility. I found it interesting that diversity emerges from simple group composition, even more so than interaction. But research also shows that putting people together from diverse backgrounds without the right kind of institutional conditions does not lead to positive outcomes. Success is contingent on context. Even though I have experienced covert racism and other challenges due to the intersectionality of my marginalized identities, I am not bitter. I believe that becoming woke has made me a stronger person and a better Christian. Pope Francis said that he wishes to emphasize that the problem of intolerance must be confronted in all of its forms, wherever any minority is persecuted and marginalized. Pope Francis urges us to combine our efforts in promoting a culture of encounter, respect, understanding, and mutual forgiveness. And it is with this mandate and my desire to continue to grow in my Christian faith and to deeply love, to forgive, and to understand that my critical consciousness and my faith have intersected. In my journey towards reaching critical consciousness, I have gained a better understanding of the complexities surrounding racism, power, and inequality. As an immigrant, my lens is different. But now that I also have American eyes, I'm trying to find myself within the American mosaic, trying to figure out how I fit and how I am an other. I rely on my faith just to know in my heart that God loves me and He created me to serve according to His will. Whether I am a person of color living in America or a sort of white morena from Brazil, I know that I am created in His image. We all are.